And welcome back to Game Escape, here today to talk about The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, one of my favorite games of all time. And if I had to, at some point, put together a list of my top 10 games, this would be very close to the top. It's a game that actually has a lot of personal meaning for me. If you checked out my SNES versus Genesis video, you'll know that I loved JRPGs, and I really wanted a Super Nintendo, but that just wasn't happening for me. So I was kind of left out, at least initially, of that era of great role-playing games. And one of the games that I really desperately wanted to own was Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. I'd played it on friends' SNES consoles, and I was just in love with that game. So I was pretty depressed about that through the early 90s, and I read one day that there was a Zelda game coming out for the Game Boy. I was very excited. I sort of followed the press on it, and it got released to rave reviews. And at the time, I was not doing a lot of handheld gaming. I had a Sega Game Gear, and it was okay, but I ultimately sort of came to the realization that I just kind of preferred to play on the television. And so, the Game Gear was for road trips or, kind of those boring events that you go to when you're a kid and you need some sort of entertainment. I never actually played a lot of it in the home. But this Link's Awakening game looked so interesting. And one day, and actually one of the reasons why I'm reviewing this game now, in addition to the fact that I just love it and I've wanted to do it since I started the channel, was that, it was I think the winter of 94. The game came out maybe in the summer or fall of 93, but it was the winter of 94, and we just had some terrible weather, lots of snow, and I remember it was a weekend, and it was just snowing like crazy. There was going to be a snow day on Monday, and I was pretty sure of this. So, I asked my parents, I said, I'm going to be really bored. Can you buy me a Game Boy and The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening? And shockingly, they said yes, and actually took me out in a snowstorm to pick it up, which was very unusual. Again, if you you listen to that, my little SNES story in that SNES Genesis video, you'll know that was a kind of a strange occurrence that they would say yes to something like that. So we went out, pelting snow, got the Game Boy, I put it in, and I was really treated to what I think is just one of the finest Nintendo games ever made. This was a game that started out as kind of an after-hours tech demo by some of the people at Nintendo, trying to see if they could actually replicate a Link to the Past on the Game Boy, and it took all of these strange turns, and finally they asked to if they could actually release this as a standalone game, and they got the okay, which is kind of funny because the game, in addition to being great, has a lot of Nintendo in-jokes, and you'll see characters like Yoshi, Marin, who's like one of your companions earlier in the game, kind of looks like Mario. There's a stage, seemingly for no reason, in the first dungeon where, you start playing side-scrolling Link and jumping on Goombas. So it was kind of evident that, this was a passion project. They had a lot of fun with this game, and it really shows, in every inch of this game world. The aesthetic of the game, the fact that they were able to capture so much of what makes The Legend of Zelda, particularly the early Legend of Zelda games, so great. They were able to capture that on the small screen is amazing, and I think the overall aesthetic of this game just shines beyond the technical limitations of the Game Boy. I mean, I think this was really one of the first Game Boy games that actually gave you a world in your hands. Now, I know people might say, well, you had the Final Fantasy Legends games that came out before this. I actually played those games, at least the first two. There may have been a third. And they were okay, but I didn't think that those games were as engrossing or as painstakingly constructed as this one. And if you think about, other role-playing games that kind of sucked you in to a new world on the Game Boy, and the only other one I can think of is Pokemon. And I think in a certain sense, Pokemon may not have been possible without the accomplishments of this game, and kind of showing that the Game Boy, this little 8-bit monochrome device, was able to produce a world of this level of beauty, and it really is a beautiful game. When I was thinking of doing this video, I actually took out my old copy and plugged it into that Game Boy that I got in the winter of 1994, and it still worked. I was still able to access one of my save files, and even on that screen, even today, now the screen on my Game Boy I think is going, but just to sit there, under a light, because of course the Game Boy was not backlit at the time, that art style still came right through, right, just popping off of that little screen. Now, of course, I had to capture it using an emulator, because I don't, you really can't capture original Game Boy footage. And even playing via emulation, you still have that grand sense of beauty and discovery in this world. The mechanics of the game are pure Legend of Zelda. Nothing is really lost on the platform. And I think that's one of the big keys to this game's success, is that even though you're on this underpowered system, even in comparison to the NES, you have a game that really rivals, in my opinion, really rivals some of the RPGs on the SNES. One of the ways that the game really succeeds is by the structure of its narrative. I'm not going to spoil it, but just this new world that you wake up in. It has a kind of dreamlike quality, but nonetheless still very similar to the traditional Legend of Zelda worlds that we as gamers were used to. It was really the perfect stage for this kind of game. It basically said to the gamer, look, we've captured what is so great about those other games. It's instantly recognizable, but we're not going to place it in Hyrule. We're not going to, say that this is kind of a direct sequel to the games that you love that took place in Hyrule. And I think that really works for this game. I mean, like I said, it has that same scale that you would find in the original Zelda, or even A Link to the Past. It again, it captures that sense of discovery, and it plays remarkably well. I mean, there's very little slowdown. I mean, you'll see it in spots when the screen is filled with enemies. There is kind of a scrolling effect when you sort of move up and down, and essentially going from screen to screen. You will see that, but the sword play is as responsive as the new Zelda game on the 3DS, which I think is pretty incredible. The sound also is just classic Nintendo, classic Legend of Zelda. I mean, it's composed of the same beeps and pops that all the other Game Boy games were subject to, but it's just done so beautifully. The theme, the Ballad of the Windfish, that I believe Marin sings to you, and also occurs when you get one of the 8 instruments you have to collect to sort of unlock the Windfish. It's a beautiful theme, and it really sounds great, coming out of that little speaker on the Game Boy. This is, I think, a rare game in the history of video games. It's a game that pushed the boundaries of its system to such an extent that it almost didn't seem possible. It seemed like a game that belonged somewhere else. And how many of those games do we really have? I mean, I think Donkey Kong Country was like that. I think more recent examples might be GTA 5 and The Last of Us, but you only get a handful of these games in any generation where you can really step back and say, wow, these developers just mastered this platform and created something so amazing out of a fairly limited set of technologies. This is, as you might guess, my favorite Zelda game. I liked it for a couple of reasons. There was no Shadow World, and I do love A Link to the Past too, but I wanted to stay in the regular green, verdant Hyrule. I didn't like necessarily having to go into the Shadow World to finish the game. Here, there's no Shadow World. There are lots of dungeons, places to explore off the main game map, but it just feels like you're exploring, one consistent place. The dungeons that you do enter are fun and well laid out. These are classic Zelda puzzles. They're fun boss fights. I thought the difficulty here was just right, and while it may not technically be better than A Link to the Past, or you might even argue it may not technically be better than A Link Between Worlds, I still think it should slot in somewhere in your top 5 of Legend of Zelda games. It is just really an absolute masterpiece. If you're new to the series, or you just weren't around back in the Game Boy era, definitely give it a shot. You can pick it up on the Virtual Console. It is well worth the price of admission. It is just a tremendous amount of fun, and it's just a game that really represents Nintendo game design at its best. I could go on and on about this game. I know a lot has been said about it, but if you enjoy The Legend of Zelda, and maybe you've played some of the newer ones, definitely go back and check this one out. It is an absolute masterpiece. I thank you as always for watching Game Escape, and I'll be back shortly with another video.